We thank you, Lord, for this time we can come together. We pray that your Spirit fills us as we learn. Help us to be humble and open as we seek to push forward your kingdom and love and support each other. And we pray for the words and guidance that Janet has to give to us today as well, Lord. In your name, amen.
Thanks, Caleb. We're going to start with a video of a wonderful book which our family, our extended family, discovered. It's called Tear Soup. It's a picture book, but it's not really for kids, although it works for kids. It's a picture book with a story for adults. And there's actually a workbook for kids now, which is a more newly designed thing. I've brought a few of my books that are on the resource list for you to have a browse over, if anything on the list sounds interesting to you. So we'll start with this video.
Hey guys, it's me, Miss Kay the Counselor. Lately, I've seen that there has been quite a bit of loss in many people's lives around me. So today, I want to share this book by Pat Schweibert and Chuck DeKellen called Tear Soup, a recipe for healing after loss. There once was an old and somewhat wise woman whom everyone called Grandy. She just suffered a big loss in her life. Pops, her husband, suffered the same loss, but in his own way. This is the story of how Grandy faced her loss by setting out to make tear soup. For many years, the custom of making tear soup had been forgotten. As people's lives became more rushed, they found it much easier to pull soup in a can from the shelf and heat it on the stove. But several years ago, Grandy got a taste of a well-seasoned tear soup. One of her friends made it from scratch after her child died. As soon as Grandy tasted the rich flavor of that carefully made soup, she promised herself never again to assume that quicker was better. Because of her great loss, Grandy knew this time her recipe for tear soup would call for a big pot. With a big pot, she would have plenty of room for all the memories, all the misgivings, all the feelings, and all the tears she needed to stew in the pot over time. She put on her apron because she knew it would get messy. It seems that grief is never clean. People feel misunderstood, feelings get hurt, and wrong assumptions are made all over the place. To make matters worse, grief always takes longer to cook than anyone wants it to. And then, Grandy started to cry. At first, she sobbed. Sometimes she wept quietly. And sometimes, when she was in a safe place where no one could hear her, she even wailed. Grandy knew she had to make much of this part of the soup alone. She learned from past experiences that most people don't like being around tears. Her friends would worry if they knew just how many tears Grandy's recipe called for this time. So, the old and somewhat wise woman reflected on her own special recipe as she looked down into the large overflowing pot of memories. It was a task she would repeat many times during the next few months. Grandy winced when she took a sip of the broth. All she could taste was salt from her teardrops. It tasted bitter, but she knew this is where she had to start. And for now, it was the only thing on her menu. There were things that Grandy never wanted to forget. These included the good times and the bad times, the silly times and the sad times. With her arms full of memories, Grandy made many trips to the kitchen. One at a time, she slowly stirred all her precious and not so precious memories into the pot. But eventually, she ran out of things to add. Grandy's arms ached, and she felt stone cold and empty. There were no words that could describe the pain she was feeling. What's more, When she looked out the window, it surprised her to see how the rest of the world was just going on as usual, while her world had stopped. Her grandson, Chester, who just wanted his Grandy to be happy again, hoped his chocolate drops would make her feel better. Mrs. Bloomclots, Miss Chadwick, and Mr. Long, all brave yet fearful neighbors, dropped by to see how Grandy was doing. They filled the air with words, but none of their words took the smell of tear soup away. Grandy was gracious because she knew how helpless her friends felt. They wanted to fix her, but they couldn't. All Grandy really needed from them at that moment was a knowing look and a warm hug. There were also days when Grandy hungered for a thoughtful ear. Sometimes she would ask total strangers, "Care to join me for a bowl of tear soup?" "No thanks," most would reply. "I don't have time for tear soup today." Even some of Grandy's friends hurried past her house and pretended not to notice the aroma of tear soup coming through her door. Grandy found that most people can tolerate only a cup of someone else's tear soup. The giant bowl where Grandy could repeatedly share her sadness in great detail was left for a few willing friends. "I'm here," Midge cried. "I got here as fast as I could, and I'll be here whenever you need me. What a tragedy. I'm so sorry you're having to make such a big pot of soup." "I don't know what to say, but I'll be glad to listen," Midge said. "Come on and tell me all about it while we make some bread to go along with your soup." "I feel like I'm unraveling," Grandy cried. "I'm mad, I'm confused, I can't make any decisions. Nobody can make me feel good. I'm a mess. I didn't realize it would be this hard." "Why don't we go for a walk while we wait for our bread to rise?" Midge suggested. "I know exercise is supposed to help me, but I feel like I have concrete blocks strapped to my legs. We'd better not go too far, or you'll have to carry me home," Grandy cried. Mrs. Cries-a-Lot called and reminded Grandy that she had been making tear soup for years and would be more than glad to come right over and show her how to make it the correct way. "Thanks, but no," said Grandy. "This pot has my name on it." Grandy knew better than to let Mrs. Cries-a-Lot or anyone else tell her what she should do to get through this terrible loss. Next, her recipe called for some comfort food. For Grandy, this meant mashed potatoes or ice cream. Comfort food always makes you feel better, at least for a little while. It gets past that big lump in your throat when other foods can't. On some afternoons, people would ask questions like, "Is it soup yet?" Or, "How long is it going to take? You've been at this for over a month now. It's time to get out of the kitchen." When Grandy was alone and needed to think, she found it helpful to keep notes on her soup making. Making tear soup is hard work. Sometimes it was all Grandy could think about. Even the things she used to love to do, she didn't have the energy for anymore, nor did she care about anymore. Some of Grandy's friends over the years had not tended to their tear soup. Their soup boiled over and the pot scorched. What a mess. It took a long time to clean up their pots and to start over. The smell of burnt soup still lingers in some of their homes. Grandy knew there were times when she needed to take a break from her soup making. Even though it was hard to do, she forced herself to get away. One day, as Grandy and Chester were going for a drive, Chester asked, "Mom says you've been making tear soup. What does she mean?" "Well, tear soup is a way for you to sort through all the different types of feelings and memories you have when you lose someone or something special. Remember when your baby brother died right before he was born, and your mom sat for days holding his blanket and weeping? She was making tear soup. And you made tear soup yourself by acting out your own disappointment when you shouted at Jason, wishing his brother would die too. Remember when Billy's dog died and he didn't want to play with you? Not feeling like having fun is one of the ingredients of tear soup also. Some days, when you're making tear soup, it's even hard to breathe, and some days you feel like running away. You just hope a better day comes along soon. And then comes one of the hardest parts of making tear soup. It's when you decide it may be okay to eat something instead of soup all the time. The next morning, as Grandy was cleaning up, Chester asked her if she was done making tear soup. Well, I don't think you actually ever finish. The hard work of making this batch of soup is almost done, though. I'll put the rest in the freezer, and we'll pull it out from time to time to have a little taste. So, what else have you learned by making tear soup, Grandy? I've learned that grief, like a pot of soup, changes the longer it simmers and the more things you put into it. I've learned that sometimes people say unkind things, but they really don't mean to hurt you. And most importantly, I've learned that there is something down deep within all of us, ready to help us survive the things we think we can't survive. Grandy, you know so much. What will I do after you die? Don't worry, I will leave my recipe for tear soup. I hope the story helps you with your recipe for tear soup. And please remember that grief takes time and looks different to everyone, so be kind to yourself.
So, makes you want to cry, doesn't it? My sisters and I found this book about 12 years ago when our mum was dying, and it's meant a lot to us. So, thanks. So, what is grief? So, it's a normal and healthy reaction to significant loss, but there's an awful lot of different kinds of loss. Can you please turn to page 3, the third page in your worksheet, and you will see discussion 1, which of these losses have you experienced? Okay, I just want you to go through the list and tick them at the moment. You don't have to write anything, you can do that later in your own time. Discussion 1, the third page through. Flick. And just tick all the losses that you've been through, and then I want you to briefly share the one that's perhaps the most recent or the most difficult with the person sitting next to you or 2 people. You found it? Sheet number 4, Sam says. Okay. Right, so don't write stuff now, there isn't time for that, but just simply go through the list and tick any of those losses you've had. Because loss is far more than just someone dying. And when you're finished, I just think it'd be great if you could tell someone at your table which is the most difficult or significant one for you. Hopefully you can see that you've had a number of different losses in your life. I think all of us have lost loved ones, but there's a whole heap of others there. Hopes and dreams are hard to let go of and keep on going often. And many of you and we as missionaries lost our country and were separated from family and our own culture and language, and that's huge. Especially people getting older have health challenges. I've got surgery tomorrow, so I know about those ones. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff there that causes the same reaction. So, after working in India with leprosy patients for decades, Dr. Paul Brand said this: "In the United States, I encountered a society that seeks to avoid pain at all costs. Patients lived at a greater comfort level than any I had previously treated, but they seemed far less equipped to handle suffering and far more traumatized by it." And I think that's true of us, isn't it? We noticed in our Pakistani village how resigned to suffering the people were, and how sensitive to suffering we were. And Tim Keller said that Christianity teaches us that suffering is overwhelming. Think of how overwhelmed Jesus was in the garden when he didn't want to die on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And suffering is real. We saw it in Jesus' life in many different ways, and we experience it ourselves, and we see it in the people we love. And suffering is often very unfair. As we saw, Job lost all his homes, livelihood, livestock, family, health, everything. And yet God made it clear that he didn't experience that because he'd been a terrible sinner and deserved it worse than anyone else. And suffering can be meaningful. Joseph said that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good to his brothers because they tried to kill him and sent him away to a far country. So in Hebrews 4:14 to 16, we learn that God is a sovereign, loving and suffering God, that he suffered. Because Jesus suffered and was tempted, just like we are, he empathizes with every weakness. They're beautiful verses to ponder on, that Jesus empathizes because he has been part of this human world and been through so much pain and suffering. Want to have a look at the emotional impact of grief? When thinking of severe losses, a writer called Jerry Sitzer, I have a couple of his books there, he says, all losses are bad, only bad in different ways. No two losses are ever the same. Each loss stands on its own and inflicts its own unique kind of pain. What makes each loss so catastrophic is its devastating, cumulative and irreversible nature. He lost his wife, his daughter and his mother-in-law in a car accident, and he and his other children were all badly hurt in that car accident. And he writes an amazing book. But just keep in mind, when we meet someone who's suffering a loss or a grief, it's not exactly the same as ours. We never fully understand exactly how that other person feels. And it doesn't help to say, I know exactly how you feel, because you don't. And it doesn't really help to say, oh, well, so-and-so suffered worse. They lost 2 children, you only lost 1. Each person's pain is legitimate. So the emotional impact of grief includes all these things. You'll see it on the notes at the front of your handout. You may feel numb and empty, lonely, isolated, scared and anxious. You might feel guilt or shame or relief. So sometimes when people lose someone from, say, dementia, they already are grieving over a long period of time that the person is changing. Or if there's a significant illness that stops the person from being able to share properly in the way they used to. So sometimes when the person dies, there's a sense of relief. And if the person suffers terrible pain, there can be a sense of relief. and that's normal and it's okay. There can be anger at the person or anger at God.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I love the belief, but suppose you had a toxic marriage. You still lost your husband or your wife, but that relief would be very different from the one you mentioned, isn't it?
Yes, so that's the other thing. There is a kind of grief I would call messy grief. And messy grief is the kind of grief where the relationship was terrible. And obviously there's relief when it ends, even through death. So, but it's a complicated feeling because often you haven't resolved the relational issues properly. And sometimes it may not be 100% messy, but if, let's say you had a fight in the morning and then the family member died in the afternoon in an accident like that, there's still a very difficult, messy experience of grieving to go through because you can no longer resolve that particular fight. So, yeah. There's obviously sadness and longing, and you stop being efficient because you're so busy grieving, and and it puts pressure on relationships. Sometimes people get horribly dependent or horribly busy. So I was talking to a friend who lost her 60-year-old husband, and she said last week was a bad week. This week's a better week. Good Friday was terrible. So Good Friday set off that pain of the death of her husband. And I think that grieving, as it said in the video, everyone grieves differently and at different paces and at different times in the day and the week and the month and the years. And that's hard on relationships, especially if you're living with that person. So when Sam's brother died with no warning at 58, his wife needed to talk about him a lot. But different kids came home to stay with her for long periods, but in the end, one by one, each kid had to leave. They were adults because they wanted to grieve without talking about Dad, and she needed to talk about Dad, and in the end, they couldn't cope with non-stop conversation. So that's a common problem when you're living with someone, and husbands and wives will often grieve at different stages at different points in the day and the week and then the month. So that's hard. There's a ball of grief that is a tangled ball of emotions. Just every possible emotion can be experienced, and it's very confusing and very overwhelming when it happens to you. And culturally, people grieve differently. Like sometimes the Aussie, British type person can be very controlled in public. In our Pakistani village, the women sat and wailed, and it was very out there in expression. So that varies. And kids grieve differently. So we lost a close pastor that we worked with for 3 years when he was 42 and to cancer. And one morning when we were helping nurse him in the last week and overnight, and the 7-year-old came down the stairs, "Is Dad dead yet?" Because, he wasn't yet old enough to tune into the deeper side of death and what it meant. So that's something, if people are kind of coping with children grieving, they actually have to read about how different age groups respond. So I'd just like you to share now with your someone at your table how you have felt physically and emotionally during a time of grief. Yeah, so emotionally, I think it depends a lot on the grief, what happens, and how you feel at different points. But physically, it's a shock that you get physical reactions to grief, I think. I don't think we always take much notice of that. When Jim died so suddenly, Sam's brother, of a heart attack, Sam was exhausted for ages afterwards, and he got quite a surprise how exhausted he was. And when I was in boarding school, in year 12, I went to boarding school and my parents were still in Papua New Guinea. I was so homesick. I had terrible stomach cramps day after day after day. So everyone has different experiences of the physical stuff. Sometimes it sets off a weakness that you have, like dermatitis or whatever. So we're all different. And here are some of them. So, yeah. So not surprising, you're exhausted, so you can't achieve as much, which is really hard if you're meant to go back to work and perform, isn't it? And and your concentration's impacted, so that's really difficult. What about the social reaction to grief? So when you're grieving about something and struggling with something, on one hand, sometimes you just want to withdraw and have peace and quiet and time to think and reflect and deal with yourself and your emotions. But other times, you want support and hugs and meaningful contact with people. And you may want isolation for 2 hours in the morning and then be desperate for contact. But someone might offer to be with you in the morning and you don't want them. And in the afternoon, when you do want them, they're not available. That's one of the really hard things about grieving. Your timing is just happens to you. You don't have the same control over it. But everyone else trying to meet your needs gets totally confused because they might think you want to be alone when you want to be having their company and vice versa. So, and that happens within the family and the house group you're in, as well as with, church friends and other friends. So it's really, really, really tough. The only thing I can suggest is the more honest you are when you are feeling like being with someone when you're grieving, and you can say that you have these up and down needs, that the easier it'll be for the friends to kind of understand. So there was one girl in our previous church, and her close friend and housemate suicided. And she found her, and it was devastating. But in her experience, when she felt like being alone, that happened, that people were available and vice versa. People got so confused that they felt too scared to reach out to her anymore, or they felt like they weren't needed. And so then she felt isolated and not sufficiently supported. So I think trying to be honest is really helpful, and understanding that just because someone says they don't want you today doesn't mean they won't want you tomorrow. You keep reaching out. So spiritually, grief challenges and often changes our perception of God. The God we thought was the loving Father has not sorted out this terrible tragedy or grief problem or ongoing loss of dreams or health or whatever. and the spiritual impact can be extremely heavy. So when that happens, we tend to ask these kind of questions. Why me? Where are you? Don't you care? Don't you love me? I think this book is a fantastic book by John Dixon. If I were God, I'd end all the pain. He lost his dad in an aeroplane accident when he was young, a young guy. So, other questions you might ask. Why am I single when so many friends are married? Don't you love me as much as them? I remember my cousin asking that. Why am I not falling pregnant? Why don't you do a miracle for me? You did it for so-and-so. Why did you take that person when that relationship mattered so much to me? So we certainly asked this question for 24 years when our daughter suffered such severe, terrible depression. And in Pakistan, there was this wonderful tribal guy who was just fantastic at talking about Jesus with other tribal people, and he was a shining light and a great encouragement to the whole team out near the desert in the hospital. And then he was killed in a car accident, and Sam and the other team members were devastated. And yeah, how do you understand in a country where there's not many Christians that God would allow that shining light to go to heaven when the light was needed where he was, in our opinion? Often we don't agree with what God's decided, do we? Not emotionally anyway. And then Sam's prayer partner drowned saving some other children. Again in Pakistan, that was really tough. And he was a great missionary guy and a wonderful prayer, and yeah, just hard to understand these things. But you know, I think Job shows us that we can ask God some very, very tough questions and tell God what we think of him, and he's big enough to take it. I think in the Psalms you often hear David saying some pretty hard things to God because he feels so distressed. So it's better to tell God really what you think than hide it all and pretend everything's fine. And yeah, thankfully God listens and he does care, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes. What's a difficult question you've asked God in a time of grief and loss? And what has comforted you the most in one of those times? Can you talk about that? What is a difficult question you've asked God in a time of grief or loss? And what has comforted you the most spiritually during a time of loss and grief? Just discuss that with your partner or trio. So here are some of the characteristics of grieving. So you feel like you're searching and longing for someone or something. You have very extreme and chaotic and unpredictable feelings that keep changing. And the feelings go round and round, so you feel a bit better sometimes and then you feel worse again, and you feel a bit better sometimes and then you feel worse again. And time is kind of distorted. You feel like you're very self-orientated, you're just surviving. And it never wholly ends. So here are some of the feelings and they don't go in a linear way, so you don't get to hope and confidence, and that's it, you've made it. So unfortunately it goes round and round. And our niece lost her 22-month-old little boy to heart issues, and this has been very much her experience. It's just been very, very hard. So what's a stug? So a stug is a kind of sudden traumatic upsurge of grief. A sudden traumatic upsurge of grief. And so it's like something triggers you and suddenly you feel really distressed again. So for me, the Tear Soup book triggers a lot of memories and makes me want to cry, because, you know, we first used that book when our mum died. But it might be a smell, a place, a kind of a colour, a food. All kinds of things can set you off in a memory of a particular person or situation where you suffered difficulty, or so I remember when our son and his wife had been married 6 years, and they thought maybe they weren't going to have children, and how painful it was to see people putting millions of photos on Facebook about their kids. So when they did finally fall pregnant, like, they never put pictures of their children on Facebook much at all, because they were sensitive about the fact that some of their friends were going through the same challenges. And I remember as a young single going to, I think I went to 6 weddings in 8 weeks as a single. And in those days, you did not dance with a girl. You either danced with a guy or you sat and watched. So I sat and watched. I was sick to death of weddings by the end. So these are tough things.
Janet, can you dance?
You ask Sam, we're not good at that.
Work in progress.
Yeah. So it's really tricky, isn't it? Managing. You're trying to manage yourself, all the things that you're trying to do to cope. Sometimes we eat chocolate or drink too much, or feel very lacking in motivation, or struggle to make new plans when we're going through all this period, and then you get these sudden things. The one good thing about a stug, so you still get really intense stugs from time to time as you grieve, and at first they're very frequent, and that's really hard. Over many years, they're just as tough, but they're spread out more. They're not as often. And you've somehow learnt to balance the grieving and the reality with time, and build new things into your life that somehow just help you cope better. But they still happen years later. So before we go to the next thing, perhaps if you just call out, talk to your neighbour briefly. What's a trigger for you about something that's tough? The first task in grieving is to say goodbye, and the aim is that you want to join back into meaningful life and relationships again. Well, sometimes you do, sometimes you just want to wallow in the grief, of course, and the sadness. What are the goals of grieving? So, one of the goals would be to accept the reality of the loss, and of course, if the thing causing your grief is very sudden, then there's shock involved at first, so you don't really accept the reality. It may take weeks before it starts to hit home. And another goal would be to become aware of and express the range of emotions present. If you don't express them, they just create terrible stuff inside you, and yes, in the end, that's much worse for you than if you actually express them, either alone and with other people. I think you need to do both. Like Grandy found, some people are better at sitting with you and sharing your grief, and other people it's not worth trying with. Another goal would be to be able to think about memories without bitter pain. Now that can take months or years, and if it's messy grief, it certainly can take years, and that's really hard. Another goal of grieving is to let go of the emotional ties you have with that situation or the person or the object. So obviously letting go of a person is really hard, but letting go of a dream or letting go of your house if it gets burnt in a fire, letting go of a job where you feel you've been unfairly pushed out or something like that, these sort of things are tough and take time. And another goal of grieving is to learn to think of oneself as an individual in a network. So because you felt more isolated by your personal pain, it takes time to feel like you want to be pulled into that group again. And that's, that's understandable, that's a slow and difficult process sometimes, but joining in life again is a positive step in the whole process of coming to grips with what's really painful for you. And then the last thing, notice it's the last thing, is building up your spiritual self again, because you've asked God all these difficult questions. You've been feeling angry with him maybe. At least you haven't understood what he's been doing. And it takes a while to get that balance back and to believe that he does love you and that he is sovereign and he does care, and that he's doing something in you through this terrible experience. Okay, so we're going to look at how to help, but I'm going to give you a bit of a test challenge before that. So if you can turn in your workbook to discussion 5, which is after the one you just did. So it'll be the turning 5 pages. Discussion 5. Tick statements or actions you agree are helpful. Put a cross if you think it's less helpful. Okay, what to say or do. So you can do this individually. Okay, tick statements and actions you agree are helpful. Put a cross if you think it's less helpful. Do you think saying, if there's anything I can do, just let me know, is ideal or not so good? Yeah, there's a few downers. That's so because the person's very confused and up and down and just can't concentrate and all of that, it's quite hard for them to make decisions. So saying something so general, if there's anything I can do, just let me know, it doesn't work because they're not up to figuring out what they need. Plus, what if 20 people say the same thing? Do you think they're going to ring all 20 or message all 20 and say, I need this? So that's not as good. The next one is better. Be more specific. If you're specific and it doesn't work for that person, oh no, I don't need dinner cooked because my mother-in-law's with me, but then they might think of something else. I'd love someone to go shopping with me because I can't face it on my own. What about don't cry, you'll upset the family? No? Good. May I pray for you before I leave? Yes. It's been 6 months. I feel like you should feel better soon and might be able to move on. No. We don't put time limits on grieving. Was your husband or wife or friend in pain when he died? Yes, that's okay. Now, you mightn't say it the first second you met them, but avoiding the difficult things often makes the person feel you're not quite with them. Try to forget the past, then you'll feel better? No. I'm sorry. Yes. Don't talk about the person who died or you'll upset the grieving person. No. So that's unhelpful because actually if someone's grieving and you never mention the person, they think that you are not remembering that person and that causes them terrible pain. The isolation of I'm the only one remembering this person is very difficult to bear. So bringing it up is okay, even if they cry. So when Sam started visiting new widows in our church in Wollongong, he often saw a photo of the husband in the lounge room and he always asked, is that your husband? And then the visit would go for 2 hours because he would hear the whole story of their marriage and how the person died. But it built a really good foundation of understanding in their relationship because he didn't avoid commenting on the person's lost loved one. So do encourage them to talk a lot about how sad they feel. Yep. Don't cry when you're with them. No, you can. It's fine if you do, although obviously if you're wailing and sobbing and they're calm, that's a bit tricky. Don't invite them to your birthday because they might feel too upset to celebrate. Yeah, I think it's better to invite them and let them be the adult who makes a decision for themselves. It's a bit patronising to make decisions all the time for people when they're having a rough time. Okay, so let's move on with modes of helping. So the first way of helping will be intervention and relief. So because of where they're at, helping them to determine what decisions are priority decisions is helpful. So asking gentle questions about things that might be priorities and helping them figure that out would be useful, and maybe even writing them down. Helping with practical tasks. I know from this church that an awful lot of you are wonderful at that kind of support with meals or babysitting or whatever it is, and that's really wonderful. So cooking, shopping, going out for coffee, all those sorts of things. Advocacy is really helpful, so it's really hard for people to go to the bank to say someone died, or go to Centrelink because they've suddenly got poor health and they need to sort out Centrelink because they can't work anymore. All those kinds of things, sometimes people might need the help of a lawyer or whatever. If you can be with them, make suggestions, etc., that really helps. And then there may be medical appointments, for instance, if someone's dealing with that kind of loss or struggle or grief. And sensitive intrusions, so in other words, don't avoid. So our niece who lost her 22-month-old has lost quite a few friends since that time. The reason being that some of these friends thought, I've got a child nearly Harry's age, that will just cause Hannah too much pain, I better avoid her. And that caused more pain because she didn't just lose a wee boy, but she lost a few friends because they chose to avoid instead of, they could have just said to her, is it too painful for you to see my little girl? And, the funeral just was so inclusive of children that wasn't where Hannah was at. So I'd like you now to discuss what thoughts, feelings or situations tempt you to avoid approaching a grieving person. And how might that person interpret your avoidance? Okay, so discuss for a couple of minutes and then we'll just do a bit of group feedback. What thoughts, feelings or situations tempt you to avoid approaching somebody who's grieving? And how might they interpret it? What kinds of feelings or situations make you want to hold back and not reach out to that person to kind of hope someone else is doing it? What did you come up with? Yes?
For me personally, I avoid people who are angry with God, like verbally making statements.
Yeah.
And yet, they're entitled, but I just find that really difficult.
Yes, so some of us might find it really hard to hear people saying they're angry with God. And the trouble is it's how things make us feel that then drives us, isn't it? Anything else that makes you hold back a bit? Yes?
Yes, unintentionally offending them or saying something that might hurt them.
Yes, so unintentionally offending or saying something you think is dumb that might hurt them more. I think a lot of people, we often feel inadequate and worry about what we should say. Remember in the video, the person that didn't say much but just said, I'm here for you and listened was the person that, helped the most. So I think our fear of saying the wrong thing is because we all talk too much. 2 ears and 1 mouth, but we usually speak with like we had 2 mouths and 1 ear. What else? Sometimes lots of people around and you think, oh, they're covered. Yeah? Something else?
If you don't have experience in the area, for example, if you have parents die or brothers and sisters die, but you haven't had children and a mother has lost a child and you think, I have no experience,
Yeah.
what could I possibly offer?
So if your experience is very different, then you might feel, oh, there might be others can reach out better. Yeah. And certainly you can't empathise to the same level if you haven't had the experience. But as we said, every grief is different and every grief is bad and valid. Therefore, there's a level of understanding. And if you reach out and the person says they've got tons of support, that's okay. But if you don't reach out, that's tricky. What else? Maybe sometimes if you're not very close to that person, and perhaps you're going through a really tough time physically, emotionally, mentally, and know you can't cope with much, you might only send a message or a card but not reach out in detail because you just feel like you can't cope with anymore. Sometimes that's legitimate. You can make sure that other people are doing that care. Yeah, there's lots of things, but not reaching out at all, not saying anything, not messaging anything is not helpful. The more support that people know they have, even if it's just a little bit, the more encouraging it is for them to keep going. So, secondly, apart from more practical helping, how do we support the people so they can recognise and go through the feelings that they need to go through? So the first thing is be a listening presence. Just be there and clarify you're just there to listen. When you listen, people experience that as empathy. So you might just by listening say, oh, that's hard. Or, yeah, I'm so sorry. Or just little things that indicate that you're with them, that you're listening. And lending your strength by being there and being available. And as time goes by, you can lend strength in more direct ways as well. And avoiding quick comfort. So letting them cry. So sometimes we Christians rush in and say, can I pray for you? Not because we want to particularly pray at that moment, but because we're feeling uncomfortable and we want to get that conversation over with. And it's a quick and easy way that sounds spiritual to end the discomfort in yourself. The same goes with Bible verses. Sometimes you can throw a Bible verse in as a way of cutting off good listening and a way of feeling more in control yourself. So sometimes you can do something that seems spiritual, but actually it's a bit self-centered. Does that make sense? So it's worth thinking about that kind of area, that rushing in with quick comfort, even spiritual comfort, can cut off their feeling that you're willing to go with the pain and take time over it.
Janet, can I just ask about people that don't show any feeling? Like, is there a place to try and help them express it?
Yes. I mean, that's a tricky one if people don't show feeling, because, I mean, it's not good for them if they hold it all inside. Obviously, you can't force it, but I think asking gentle questions can can sometimes help them come out. And I think people like that need longer time of just companionship and listening and caring before they build enough trust to start letting out their feelings. But yeah, that is a difficult one. Watching the tear soup video might get them going, you never know. So there's also encouragement towards active memory making, and that might help. So if they refuse to remember or talk about memories, the person's got a bit stuck in the whole process of grieving in a way that's not helpful to them. So notice that. If they remember the last encounter over and over again, and that goes on for a long time, that's difficult. I mean, Heather and I know that the two sisters who were with Mum when she died, at first, the memory that kept replaying was that sudden going, wasn't it? And it took time before the memory of everything else beautiful about Mum was surfacing more and more, and that difficult memory of that last minute receded. So it's okay to struggle with the last memory scenario, but not for years on end. If that's where they get stuck, that's not helpful. Sometimes people romanticize and make everything sound perfect beforehand, and then when something was lost or some situation was lost, so that's common when, I remember Sam telling me that some of the British guys that worked at the steelworks constantly talked about the old country, and everything was wonderful in Britain and everything was terrible in Australia. And one of the guys said, "Oh, okay, if you want to go back there, we'll pass the hat around and we'll get enough money to send you back." And the funny thing is, an elderly Irish couple from our church went back after years of her grieving, having left Ireland. And lo and behold, when she got there, it wasn't nearly the same as she remembered, and then she couldn't wait to get back to Australia. So, and then sometimes it's negative memories that are highlighted, and that's all you can think of. So, and that's okay at the beginning, but it's not okay if it goes on for years, obviously. And of course, if the person's using the present tense about a situation in the first week of that happening, that's fine, that's obviously understandable, but it's not such a good thing if way down the track the person is using the present tense as though that situation or person is still very much in the way, especially if it's to do with death. So if you notice those problems, this person's going to need professional help. Okay? Just being a friend isn't good enough if someone's having this much difficulty, and so they need a psychologist or counsellor to work it through. They may not be willing to go, but it's something to encourage them towards. So, and number 4, how do you help a person begin life again despite their grief? So, if you help the griever discover and grow their own emotional resources. Now, this takes time, of course, but if you're doing things with that person, listening, being with that person, and others are doing the same, they will grow stronger. Just because, like a flower grows with water and good soil and sunshine, so they will grow stronger. And then you can start even encouraging them towards a podcast, a book, just little things that might actually speak into their life and scripture. And helping the person join in the community again. So if it's to do with somebody, say, losing a husband or wife, helping them integrate back into the small group, into the church, into the social club or whatever it is. That needs encouragement and support. And helping the person work through the why questions. So when the person's just really distressed about a loss, it's not the time to talk about theological stuff and try and help them work through all their difficult questions about God. You just listen and say, yeah, that's really a hard question. Don't try and answer it. There's a lot of questions that are not answerable. And living with the grey, unanswered questions is part of life, unfortunately. And we won't know the answers till we're in heaven. And it is really hard. But somehow building enough strength and faith to move towards trusting God again. It's a journey. But you can encourage and help them, but not in the early stages. Just when they seem much in better place and ready. So Cassie, what you brought up, the problems in grieving, the main difficulties are allowing oneself to feel and express deep feelings. And that tends to happen because, one, we're intolerant of pain, or we just need to have control. Isn't that the hardest thing about grieving something? Whatever it is that we're grieving, whatever loss, we've lost control of our life, we've lost control of that bit of our life and that circumstance, and we don't cope with that. I don't cope well with that. Losing control of what happens when in your life is really tough, and it makes you feel very vulnerable and insecure. So it's hard to grieve and to let go of that control and accept that you don't have that control. And the other one is a lack of external encouragement from others. So if we get the last one right, then we build up the strength in helping the person tolerate pain better, and we also help them deal with the fact that they don't have control over this situation. So here's a quote: "To be human is to suffer. The isolation that suffering creates is transformed by the assurance that the God who hung on the cross always suffers with us. It is He who enables us to suffer with one another." I think a lot of us love this verse. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And I think in my life that's been true. That in my weakness, that's when I've been aware that God is gracious and that He does stuff through the suffering and the pain. We would say that on the mission field we went through hell sometimes, especially me, but that was a highlight of my lifetime, even though it was the hardest time. And I think it was a highlight because we learnt fully that God loves us unconditionally and that He is sovereign through those really hard difficulties. And it's strange that sometimes suffering can set you off in a path where you grow and learn about yourself and God in new ways. I think the trouble with suffering, though, it can make you move towards bitterness, and that's something that we all have to work on, that moving towards bitterness just makes chaotic, horrible mess of ourselves and the suffering situation. Whereas if we look carefully at how God is at work, he can actually make beauty out of ashes. So how does God use suffering? Sometimes he transforms our attitudes to ourselves. We see our weakness and pride. And sometimes it really changes our attitude to the good things in our lives and makes us notice the things we can be grateful and thankful for. And it can also strengthen our relationship with God who's suffered. It's certainly when we lived in an isolated village in the desert, it made a big difference to me knowing that God came out of heaven to a human world. So he knew how I felt when I went from a city in Australia to the middle of nowhere. So that experience that Jesus had in the world really can help us, and the suffering he went through on the cross. So here we have some resources of hope, scripture, prayer, you and the Christian family. And in your handout, there are some Bible passages of hope for your use. And then on the second back page, sharing Bible verses with people who are grieving or depressed. Okay, I just want to clarify that helpful verses to share with somebody focus on God and his character. They don't focus on what you should do or feel. So one lady who just lost her husband said that she really believed in the Romans verse that says that everything... Oh, hang on, help me out, Sam. All things work together for good. I just went blank. For them that love God. Now, that is obviously unhelpful to say to someone who's just lost their husband. So she said, I really believe that verse, but I didn't need it then. So if you say with someone with a lot of fear and anxiety, you don't keep throwing verses at them about not being anxious and not being fearful and stuff. That doesn't help. It makes them feel worse. So the helpful verses focus on God and his loving character. And they might identify with how bad we feel, but they usually do point to God as well. So there's one page back there with a range of them that are more helpful. So now the last thing I want to get you to do now is to look at the page just before that. Sorry, it's been a bit hard to find everything. So, discussion 8, scenarios of loss and grief. Okay, it's the second last page turning. Okay, the most important thing you can do is to listen to comfort and support this person. Talk about how they might feel and what challenges might be confronting them. Choose one of these scenarios to discuss with someone at your table. Your cousin's husband just divorced her. Your friend's mother has just died. Your neighbour lost his job a year ago and can't get another job. Your friend's dream of marriage and children hasn't happened. Your friend has suffered chronic illness or mental illness for a long time. Okay, so these are all difficult things. Just choose one between you and talk about how they might feel, what challenges might be confronting them, because you're going to practice listening to yourselves share about that. None of us have been through exactly the same hard things in life. None of us are the same personalities. We're not from the same family, but we're all human and we have similar feelings. So we can always listen and empathise with the feelings, even though our experience is not the same. And I mean, these days you can read up on stuff to try and get a bit more understanding of what someone's going through, and that's important to do that homework. Here's a question. Regarding goals of grieving, what does one's spiritual life look like before you reintegrate spiritually? So I think before you reintegrate spiritually, you're struggling with questions and up and down feelings about God. And you just need a loving, accepting, listening ear and someone who promises to keep praying for you and with you if the person is willing to be prayed for in their company, and not tackling the difficult questions early is really important. But if person gets further along and they really want to wrestle and they seem strong enough to wrestle with questions, you may not feel adequate to help them with those difficult questions, and that's where you can get a caring pastor involved or a Christian counsellor or someone like that if you feel like you just can't deal with that. Because one of the problems with grieving is coming to terms with a less than ideal, difficult situation that's going on forever. And the same goes with unanswered questions about faith. It does go on forever till heaven, like we never answer them all, we never quite understand everything. So learning to live with that difficult imbalance is not easy for us as human beings, but in a way that's how we have to live. And so it's somehow building the strength to cope with questions that aren't answered properly is actually really part of maturity, and it's not an easy place to get to. And I think we go up and down. As I said, the grieving goes round and round and up and down, so that you never get reintegrated spiritually properly until heaven. So all of us have times where we're challenged a bit more. We have a little doubt here or a struggle there. That's part of being a human being and not being in heaven yet. So that's a tough one. Now, if there's any other people... here's another one. It seems as though people who are active in church suffer tremendously. Is that Satan's work targeting those who work hard for the Lord? I think it's because we're in community that it seems like we suffer a lot. But actually, I think the whole world as a community suffer terribly, and God does clarify in the scriptures that his people suffer, and the people who are not his people suffer, and good people suffer, and sometimes terrible people don't suffer. Like, there's just no fairness in the suffering stakes. And when you think of our church and suffering, and then you think of what's happening in the war zones in the world, actually, like, we have it a bit easier than some. So I think it's more that we're in community, so we're sharing and we're more aware of each other's pain, and that's important. But we do have to look outside and realise the rest of the world suffers too. Just we don't have such a close relationship with those people. I hope that answers it. And I think we have to stop now, but if there are more questions, I'll hang around after. I'm happy to chat.